welcome. I get myself on video. So good to see you all here today. And I think we're going to have a lovely event. And by the way, this is going to be recorded. So if you have friends you'd like to send this to, it will be on our website. We have links to all of our videos there, all of the Zooms we've done, if you're interested to see what we've had done in the past. And today, if you look in the chat, if you look at the top of the chat, you'll see a link. And if you click on that link, that will permit you to order the book that we're talking about today, The Everglades, Stories of Grit and Spirit from the Mangrove Wilderness. I'm very happy to say that we have two wonderful authors with us today. They're McCrary Sullivan and Holly Genzen. And I will introduce them, and then I'm going to turn the discussion over to them. And after they have spoken and done their presentation, I'm sure they'll be up for Q&A. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Holly? And okay, sounds excellent. Okay. Our speakers today are McCrary Sullivan. And she grew up on the coast of North Carolina. She's lived in Florida for more than 30 years. She's a Florida master naturalist with an MFA in poetry. She's been artist in residence in Everglades National Park, Big Cypress National Preserve, and at the Hambidge Center in Georgia. She has articles, chapters, and poems in many literary and academic publications, and is author of Ecology 2, Throat Song from the Everglades, which is a book of poetry. She's co-author of Paddling the Everglades Wilderness Waterway. She holds a PhD in English education from the University of Florida, has been poetry editor of the English Journal, and a Fulbright scholar in Nigeria. She lives on the Gulf Coast of Florida and spends as much time as possible in the Everglades. She's here with Holly Genzen, who's a Florida master naturalist and an outdoor education specialist. She has a master's in outdoor education and a PhD in educational administration. Holly has completed a solo through hike of the Appalachian Trail and has paddled more than 1,000 miles in Central and South Florida. She is co-author of the guidebook, I assume, along with our other author today, Paddling the Everglades Wilderness Waterway, an effort that required extensive research into the social and natural history of the area. Her experiences in natural Florida have been the inspiration for her artwork, both in paintings and in her daily nature sketchbook. She has also been a volunteer at Shenandoah National Park in Central Florida, excuse me, is currently her home base. Please welcome Anne and Holly.
Hey. Thank you, Georgia. I'm going to try to get a screen share going here so we can have some images. Let's see how this works. Okay, and so you don't have to see all that stuff on the side. There we go. Can you see that?
Yes.
All right. In order to tell you how we got the idea to write this book, we need to tell you a little bit about the other book. We spent 6 years out there paddling those mangroves in order to write Paddling the Everglades Wilderness Waterway. And when we finally had finished that project and Menasha Ridge Press had offered us a contract, and we went out paddling just for the fun of it, not for the work of the book, and to sort of celebrate having reached the end of that trail. And while we were out there, we met a couple of other paddlers. Bill Leonard, who was in his 70s, and a friend of his were camped at Alligator Creek, where we were also camped. And we sat on overturned buckets out there in the evening. And as we listened to Bill talk about how he had come down from Maine year after year to paddle this waterway, I was thinking, and Holly was thinking, and when we went back in the tent, we looked at each other and we knew we had the same idea. We had another book to write, collecting stories of people who go out there in the mangroves for a wide variety of reasons. So that's how this book, Stories of Grit and Spirit, came into being. Those mangroves, we all know in Florida that they are not only beautiful, they're really important. They provide a storm surge, windbreak, they prevent erosion, and they're a nursery. Virtually every bit of seafood that we get out of the Gulf is nurtured in the roots of the mangroves in that estuary. You can see all kinds of tiny things living down there, and some of them are in microscopic stages. You really can't see them at all. What we did not know, however, and what we're finding that a lot of people don't yet know, is that mangroves provide acre for acre the most effective carbon sink on the planet, more than a rainforest, more than any upland forest. They are powerhouses for storing carbon. We are not hearing enough about that. It is clearly another reason to preserve our mangroves, and we hope that that information will become part of the larger dialogue soon. Holly?
Okay. Much of what we think of as land out there are really islands of mud and detritus caught in those mangrove roots. And there are no roads to go out there into the mangrove wilderness. You either have to take a fish route, or a bird route to go by boat or by plane. And if you want to stay out there, you have three options. You can stay on a beach on the Gulf, or you can stay on a designated park site on a shell mound, pitch your tent out there, or you can stay on a structure like this, which is called a chickie. They're either double chickies or single chickies like this one is, and you just pitch your tent out there and the Park Service provides a little privy on the chickie. And I wanted to then tell you about how we created the book. The first thing after we talked to Bill and looked at each other and said, you know, we've got another book to write, we had to search for people to interview for this book. And what I think of it as a treasure hunt. One person kind of led us to another person. We'd interview one person and they'd suggest, oh, why don't you talk to this other person? And that's how we got started. So when we found the people that we wanted to interview, then we had to talk with them and figure out where we were going to meet for the interview. We recorded all of the interviews. And then when we got home from the interview, we did what I consider to be the most tedious part of the whole process, transcribing word for word all those interviews. And I think that the people that we interviewed wouldn't have been so open to talking to us if we didn't guarantee to them that we would share what we were going to include in the book with them. So after we transcribed the interviews, we sent that transcription to the participant, and then they could look at it and read it and say, oh my goodness, I wish I hadn't said that, or please don't include that. So we took their input and changed the interview, cut out the things that they didn't want to include, and then we sent those back to them. And then a third time, our publisher asked if we could please shorten each story. So it was kind of a long process. Now, what we plan to do is when sometime in the near future, we hope to give all of these full transcriptions to the Everglades National Park Archives. Anne.
Okay, so we ended up with all these stories. And we had to figure out how are we going to organize them and turn them into a book. And it was, in the very beginning, it was puzzling because we could not create simple categories. These people defied categories. We'd be talking to someone who works in the park, and they'd be talking about their work, and then they'd talk about fishing out there or going out for some sort of renewal or other reasons. So many people were going out there for multiple reasons, not just one reason. So we couldn't have a chapter on paddlers and a chapter on people who work there. It wasn't going to work. Pretty quickly, we arrived at three groups of people. The people who do work there, those would be full-time rangers, seasonal rangers, and full-time volunteers. And people who went out there paddling, and people who knew the park before it was a park. But the people who went out there paddling were a really big category. So we ended up dividing that. There were some people who were absolutely devoted to canoes, and they were very clear about that. So they got their own chapter, and everybody else paddling got their own chapter. And we ended up with these four parts. The part 4, they knew these mangroves way back when. Mostly those were people who were either working in the park when it was becoming a park, or they grew up in the area that became the park. We really wanted maps in this book, and Holly drew these maps painstakingly. The map on the right, you can see, runs all the way from Everglades City in the north down to Flamingo in the south. That's the 99-mile wilderness waterway. And all of that area that waterway runs through is mangrove.
Oh.
We really wanted an index of place names because we got so frustrated when we were doing our research for the first book and trying to learn everything we could about specific places. We would be looking things up in books and there would be no index. So we wanted an index. Here's Bill.
Okay. This is all the background to how we constructed the book, but the heart of the book are the stories. And my first interview was with Bill Leonard. My husband and I went up there to Maine, and we interviewed him on a picnic table outside of his farmhouse in Poland Springs, Maine. This picture on the left actually is Bill and his friend Mike. Our conversation that led to the whole book. That's Alligator Creek campsite. Well, Bill and his wife, after they retired, spent their winters down in Florida like a lot of people do. And they were looking for some organization to join, and they joined the Happy Hoofers chapter of Florida Trail. And Bill and his wife, and then Bill on his own, after his wife passed away, took a lot of paddling trips with the Happy Hoofers. Excuse me. And I'm going to read a little piece of one of these paddling trips that Bill took. And before I start reading, you need to know that on this trip, Bill and his friends were paddling the Wilderness Waterway. They started up in Everglades City and ended up in Flamingo. And like Ann was telling you, you can go inside the whole way through the mangroves without having to paddle out into the Gulf of Mexico. But the trickiest part of this, one of the trickiest parts, is a section called the Nightmare. And it's called that because it's very narrow and it's like a tangle of mangroves, twists and turns. And in addition, you cannot pass it. You can't go through it on low tide. It's just, it dries up. It's impossible to go through. So it's tricky, and that's the background. And in the end, you'll find out about this cartoon drawing. Okay, this is Bill speaking. At Broad River, we got up early to do the Nightmare. I'm in the first canoe and Nancy's up front, and there's a mangrove tree uprooted and down across the channel. Now, I had a whitewater canoe, flat bottom, so I go right over it. But as we were going over, I jumped out. I said, there's no way that Bill Haynes and that big grumman is going to get over this. I'll have to help him. The canoes were coming on, and one by one, we pulled them over the downed tree. Bill Hayes turned out to be the last, and we were in that marl muck clear to my waist. We finally got that big grumman over. I'm covered with muck, clear to my elbow. That night, we made it all the way up the Harney River, across Carbon Bay to Avocado Creek, and then to Cane Patch. It was an absolutely gorgeous campsite, a big shell mound. But I'm still covered with mud. I say to Art, I'm jumping out of the canoe right into the water. And so I jump in, clothes and all. And I pop up in the water nose to snout with a big old alligator. Art, he's a cartoonist, said, I've never saw anybody just bolt out of the water and end up on the dock like that.
That was Holly's first interview. My first interview was with William Truesdale. William Truesdale wrote this little guidebook, which is about the size of half of a sheet of printer paper, in the late 60s. So it was the first guidebook, and it was the only guidebook until Holly and I wrote an updated one. And that's a picture of Bill there in 1968 in the motorboat when he was a ranger in the park. He was he spent a lot of time out there mapping things, describing things, but there was only about a half a page of description on each page. And by the time Holly and I were paddling out there, we were really wishing for something a little more substantial. And that's what we wrote. We ended up writing the book we wished we'd had. But until then, this was all there was. And this was the little Bible for pretty much anybody who wanted to go out there and paddle that whole waterway. So we knew that we wanted to talk to him, but I couldn't find him. I Googled William G. Truesdale, I don't know how many times over a period of weeks, and William Truesdale and W.G. Truesdale. And then one day I was in the archives at Everglades National Park, just doing some historical research on the waterway. And I was reading reports that had been written by Truesdale when he was working there. And one after another, the reports were signed William Truesdale, until one that was signed Bill Truesdale. I thought, aha, I've never Googled Bill Truesdale. So I Googled Bill Truesdale. And what do you know? There was a Bill Truesdale volunteer leading wildflower walks in Joshua Tree National Park. I knew instantly it was him. So I called the park and they put me in touch with him. And long story short, I flew to California and spent a whole day with Bill and his wife. And most of what we did during that period of time, Bill had taken hundreds, maybe even in, probably more than 1,000 photographs during his time there, and had put them into these massive albums. So he was turning pages and showing me pictures and talking about things. And we ultimately adopted a sort of photo album approach to his chapter. There are a number of pictures that he took then and his comments about them. But I want to read you one little thing that, that he said about the waterway generally. It was a popular thing to do waterway trails and guides, early 70s. When it was first established, there were no limits or controls or rules for the Everglades Wilderness Waterway. We didn't have that many campsites, and we didn't have that many users. Canoe use wasn't big at that time. Kayaks, what are they? Never even heard of them. Once we laid it out, the waterway had to be marked, of course. We would go out there with a flat barge loaded with 16-foot posts, use a water pressure pump to dig them in. I tell you, it was hot and buggy. We had a government issue repellent that had the same basic ingredients as commercial repellents, but 10 times the strength. You could stand one dousing, but when you put on another layer, it would start the skin burning. We sprayed our clothes and most often wore long sleeves. There are 3 pictures here for one story. An interesting thing happened. Tony Terry told a story, and Roger Hammer told the same story from a different point of view. And this plant in the middle, the beech napaca, also called scaviola, is a character in the drama. So Holly, you want to read a little bit from Tony?
Okay, I'm reading Tony Terry. Once I was out on Cape Sable and saw this guy. I was going to write him a ticket for disturbance of natural features. I was younger and I had a stereotype. It was part of my survival. If this guy has long hair and a shaggy beard, he's probably a redneck and he's not going to deal with me very well. I'll write this ticket, just hand it to him, tell him what he's done wrong and not have to spend much time with him. So I ran the numbers on his boat and it came back with his name. I put that down. Then I pulled up to him. He has his anchor line tied to a beech napaca tree. I know what that is now, but I didn't then. He was in his boat and he was horsing it, brrr, trying to pull that tree off the beach. I thought, dumbass, man. God, that's a dumb guy. So I pulled up to him and I said, stop what you're doing right now. He looked at me and he says, do you know who I am? Or something like that. And I said, no, I really don't care. He says, I'm Roger Hammer. I said, that's what your driver's license says. Then he started talking to me about the plant. He told me what it was, and it was an exotic plant. I happened to be working Brazilian pepper at the time, spraying Brazilian pepper in Flamingo. So we sprung a conversation about exotic plants. I didn't tell him I'd already wrote the ticket and called it up to dispatch. And if he gave me any hell, I was going to arrest him. He went on explaining to me about beech napaca, and I'm like, okay, but don't ever tie up to another tree again. It looks really bad. Yeah, that looked really bad. I don't know how he came up with that, but it was a good solution to get that tree off the beach, tying it to his boat and yanking it off.
Some of you may have Roger Hammer's books on your shelves. He is a wildflower expert in Florida and has also written a number of guidebooks. So he knows that he's pretty famous, but Tony Terry didn't know who he was, at least not at that time. So here's Roger's account of the same event. He said, I was talking to my friend Tony Terry. He's a law enforcement officer in Everglades National Park down at Flamingo. Real nice guy. The first time Tony and I ever met, I was camping on Middle Cape. And you know that plant, scaviola? It's a non-native invasive plant called beech napaca. There was a bunch of them growing on Middle Cape. And I thought, I'll just do my civic duty and help get rid of them. I had a power boat that time. So I backed it up near the shore, took the anchor rope and tied it to the stern. And then I'd run up there on the beach and tie the other end to a scaviola. And then I'd just get up on a plane and all of a sudden this plant would go flying out of the ground into the Gulf. So while I was doing that, Tony was coming around the Cape. He looks over there and sees this boat hauling ass when this plant comes flying off the beach into the water. He's like, what the hell is that? He still talks about it. He says, I get out there and there's this wacko guy, some old hippie, yanking plants off the beach.
Okay, I think one thing I found, and I'm pretty sure Anne found too, that when we were trying to figure out who we would be interviewing, it was almost like a treasure hunt. One person led us to another. This man was kind of difficult to get a hold of. Toby Nipper. He's a member of the Water Tribe, which is a group of people that does canoe and kayak races from Everglades City down to Key Largo. And I interviewed Toby at the Gulf Coast Visitors Center in Everglades City before it was wrecked with the hurricane. And after I interviewed him, he and his friend went out into the water. Oh, I don't know if I remember to tell you this, but the race is called, the organization is called Water Tribe, and Toby Nipper's boat name was Cracker Knives. So this is what he told me at Gulf Coast Visitors Center, a little bit of what he told me. I got a thing on my boat that says, attitude is the difference between an adventure or an ordeal. That's right on my boat. And it's true. You go with somebody that the day's raining and they're complaining, it's miserable, it sucks. Well, they got a wrong attitude. Now they're going to make me miserable. It's like, oh, the bugs are awful. I can't stand it. Don't want to go anymore. To complain would be like going on the Appalachian Trail and getting to Pennsylvania saying, I hate rocks. It's all attitude, mindset. And with common sense, these trips work well. One of my mentors told me, if you are cold, paddle harder. If you cannot sleep, you need to be paddling. Wake up at 03:30 like some of us old guys do. The hell with just laying there. Pack it up right then. Or if base camping, shove the boat off and do a loop. Skeeters are bad at camp, but once you get out there on the water, the stars are awesome. You just got to know how to adapt. The more of this I do, the more I find it's more about the people you do it with or what you get out of it than the toys. Toys are nice, though. A big tarp to sit under, a camp chair, some wine. Just be careful and know your toy will work for what you want. After all, a Kruger is just an overpriced canoe to some. Overpriced for the weekender, for sure. Come live in my world and see how nice it can be. Best advice I ever got from a beer drinking buddy about buying or doing something. You are dead a long time.
Some of the people we talked to were scientists. And Rick and Jean Seavey are scientist volunteers. They've retired from their work jobs up north and have made a research life in Everglades National Park. Their specialty is lichens. And you can see on the screen, I think, the smaller image on the right, the kind of yellow stuff on the mangroves. We see that a lot. Probably if you've been out there at all, you've seen it too. It's a very common lichen. But this odd looking gray stuff on the left is a very rare one. And in fact, it's one that they discovered. So I'm going to read you how they named this lichen that they discovered. By the time we came to the Everglades, we knew most every plant in New England. Here, it was a new world, a new adventure, new plants, new flowers. And so people say, what keeps you in Florida? We say, well, we've got a big backyard that we haven't explored fully yet. We found some species of lichens that are new to science, named them and published papers. One of these is Interographa murriana, which we named for the lady that colonized Murray Key. The story that's passed out is that Mr. and Mrs. Murray settled on Murray Key. He died at an early age, and she raised 7 children on that key. I mean, stop and think about that. I don't know how old the children were when Mr. Murray died. I don't even know the gender of the 7 children, whether they were all girls or all boys or whatever. But somebody had to go fish, take the dory out there and get supper. Interographa murriana honors Mrs. Murray and the Murray family.
Okay, the man in the back in this picture is Rick Horton. And Ann and I met Rick for the first time on the Harney River Chickie. That's a double chickie, so there are 2 platforms, 2 groups can stay. He had some interesting stories to tell, and he had a philosophical attitude, so we thought, Rick's going to be a good person to add to our book. And I went to his home that he built. It's a beautiful home in LaBelle on the banks of the Caloosahatchee River. And his story is part of the book, although we're not going to read his part of his story today. But he talked to us about Wanda Brown Townsend, his neighbor in LaBelle. Well, Wanda Brown Townsend originally grew up in Chokoloskee Island out of Everglades City. She was born in 1933. And of course, we were interested in interviewing Wanda. And Rick had this idea, well, why don't we go out in Chokoloskee Bay and go to Fakahatchee Island? And we can interview Wanda there, because you can interview Wanda there, because she didn't grow up on Fakahatchee, but she did have relatives there and visited there a lot. So he borrowed a neighbor's kayak for Anne and me to kayak in, and he got cushions and pillows and made Wanda very comfortable in the front of his kayak. And then she had a microphone pinned to her red shirt there, and we asked questions as we paddled out to Fakahatchee Island, and also questions when we were walking around on Fakahatchee Island. I think that's the introduction that I want to give, but I want to say that we brought lunch.
What did you just say?
We brought
it.
lunch.
Oh, we brought lunch. Yes, we sure did. We always take lunch. So Holly and I will both be reading here because we have Rick's voice and Wanda's voice. But Wanda says, we're going to need some plates out of that bag and some forks. I think I brought everything, napkins. Now, you all have some of this meat. And guess what it is? It's venison.
Wanda wants to be sure we all have energy and can get back. The only way Wanda gets back is if we all get back. It's probably been 50, 60, 70 years since somebody's eaten venison on Fakahatchee Island.
That's right. And we've got plenty of potato salad.
Wanda, when you picture your mama, what do you see her doing?
Just housewife. All we children had was school and church. And she was just home. She took care of us and visited in the neighborhood, you know. She made all of my school clothes. I couldn't wait for her to make me a new dress. We had them big bows in the back, you know, that tied, great big wide bows.
Only a housewife. She cooked all the meals, cleaned up after everybody, washed all the clothes, probably made all the clothes.
Only mine.
Where did James get his?
Catalog, order them, Sears and Roebuck, Montgomery Ward, and Albans.
How come he got his clothes from the catalog?
Because Mama didn't make them. But in my early teens, Jigs, he'd say, Wanda, make me out of order. And then he'd tell me what he wanted. And then he'd let me order something. Every time I made out of order, I always got a dress. Anybody want some more? Eat all you want.
I've never had any venison this tender before. Wanda's cooked me up some alligator this way. She puts it through a little sort of macerator, and that makes it very tender.
The Indians used to camp around on Chokoloskee Island, you know. I was just a kid, and, you know, you read books. And I was so scared of them. We had to walk to the post office to get the mail every day. I'd tiptoe. I'd be real quiet going around them Indians because I thought they was going to get me. And almost to the post office at that corner, they was always camping there. And they always had a big iron pot cooking something, stirring it with a big wooden spoon. I'd be sneaking by them Indians real quiet, thinking they wouldn't see us, and right out there in the open. They wouldn't have hurt us. They were good people. I should have stopped by and eat lunch with them where they were making their soup in that big old pot out on an open fire. Did y'all get enough food? Okay, so that's it for samples. They're little tiny snippets from, we had 21 different stories in here, and they're pretty comprehensive stories that cover a lot of ground. We are so grateful to all the people who talk to us. Sometimes they talk to us for hours, sometimes on more than one day. It turned out to be a really wonderful experience because of the people we got to meet and the stories they told and the friendships we formed. Some of these people we now consider friends, and we have continuing communications. Anything you want to say, Holly?
No, that about says it all.
Well, here's our contact information if you ever want to be in touch with us, and we would be very happy to answer questions now.
Would you like to stop your screen share?
I guess so. Let's see. Stop share.
Yeah, there you go. Now we can see everybody. So, okay, that was really fascinating. I love the photos of that. Who would like to say something or engage in the conversation? I think you can unmute yourselves. If not, I can send you an invitation to unmute. Dina, you're on mute. Dina, you're muted.
Now I think
There
it's
you go.
okay.
There you go.
I loved this. It was wonderful. I had no idea there would be such variety. So I wanted to ask you about finding the Everglades, both of you, how you came to be master gardeners and people who really know the Everglades in ways that probably very few people do. I just love the presentation. Thank you. So tell me, like your first trip to the Everglades, what was it like? And did you know then that you'd fallen in love with the place?
Want to go first, Holly?
Okay, I'll go first.
Thanks.
I came to the Everglades the first time to do the Everglades Wilderness Waterway because Anne invited me. She was really interested in the Everglades, particularly women in the Everglades, but she didn't want to paddle out there on her own. So she invited me. I don't remember what else you asked about. I don't remember what else you asked there, Dina, but maybe Anne does, and she can answer the rest of the question.
Well, she was wanting to know how we formed a relationship with the place. Why did we fall in love with it, basically?
Yeah.
Well, I do remember we made so many mistakes on the first trip. I got terrible cuts from shells because I wasn't wearing shoes. We didn't have all our gear covered, but we laughed every day. It was just a wonderful, wonderful trip. That very first trip. Every other trip has been wonderful too, but there was just something magical about it. We enjoyed the nightmare of the very first time we ever did it. Now I think we would like to avoid the nightmare if we possibly can. Anne just was down there recently again and kind of got stuck on a tree just the way Bill Leonard described it, but it's just a continuing love affair with the place.
Thank you.
I see Lori put several questions into the chat. Lori, would you like to voice your questions or would you like me to read them? Lori, you could
go ahead and read, please.
Okay, all right. She has a couple of questions. I'll take the first one. She asked, do the mangroves require a lot of water to survive? And of course, I guess they're in salt water, right? So that's interesting.
They're in brackish water.
Right.
It's an estuary. It's where fresh water flows off the land and salt water comes in from the Gulf. And it's that mix of brackish water that mangroves seem to love. It's one of the few trees that can thrive in salt water, but it's interesting because they don't require salt. As a matter of fact, they have to exclude salt, but they have mechanisms for doing that.
Amazing.
Yeah, and Lori's other question is kind of related to that. She says, I thought I remember something about the mangroves drying out in the Everglades when she lived there during droughts. So are there fires in the Everglades, and do the mangroves grow back if they catch fire?
You want to talk about that one, Holly, or you want me to?
Well, I would say that the fires in the Everglades, well, you can finish up this. I'll start out. I think the fires in the Everglades that most people think about are more inland, not so much on the water where the mangroves live?
Well, the Everglades used to be a lot bigger than they are now. You know, they used to run all the way from Lake Okeechobee down to the Keys, and that's no longer the case. But when that was the case, fires were a natural part of the ecosystem. Usually the fires were started by lightning. You know, we have a lot of lightning in Florida. And that was not a bad thing. In fact, they light fires deliberately in the Everglades, including in the mangroves. They burn what they call mosaic. So they don't want to burn it all out flat. They just burn like small areas or little lines, because those become habitat. So it's part of the deliberate burning because it no longer happens naturally or not as often. And they do come back.
And there's a question from Alice Bowman. How do you become a master naturalist?
The University of Florida has a program. It's a sequence of courses. It's run through the Florida Agricultural Extension Agency. So if you Google how to become a Florida master naturalist, that information will come up if it's something that interests you. And you used to have to go and attend classes, but like so many other things, a lot of it is now happening online, which makes it more accessible to people. It's both rigorous and fun.
Well, I have a question for you. How long did it take you to write this last book? I would imagine getting all of those interviews took quite a bit of time.
This is a woman who knows about books and how they get made. From that day when we looked at each other and knew we were going to write a book until the day we held the book in our hand was 10 years.
Wow, I'm not surprised.
Yeah,
That's quite a project.
it was.
Are you going to do another?
No
sequels?
No sequel. That's because Holly is working on her own things now, and I'm working on my own things. So,
well, then tell us what you each are working on right now. That would be interesting to know.
Holly?
Well, I paint and I sketch every day. And so I am working on a book of mostly Florida wildflowers, descriptions and sketches to go along with them.
Oh, interesting. Anne, how about you?
Well, I'm working on several things. I'm actually writing full time. And I'll have another book out later this month based on the year that I spent in Nigeria.
Oh, interesting.
So I'm looking forward to having that in hand. And meanwhile, I'm working on a personal book based on my paddling journals, about 18 years worth of paddling journals. But it will be very different from the kinds of things that Holly and I have written, themes of home and family and loss and regaining. I'm pretty deep into that one. And then there are several others lined up waiting for when I finish that.
Okay. It's lovely to have projects in the pipeline, I have to say.
It is.
Yeah, something to look forward to. Anyone else want to say anything or have questions?
I have another question, if that's all right.
Sure.
Holly, because you walked the whole Appalachian Trail, I'd like to know, where does the Everglades fit in? Was that after you had done that? Or did you do pieces of the trail and intersperse it with different times in the Everglades?
No, I did the trail all in one experience. Started in the spring and ended in the fall, right before school started. It was the trail was much more difficult for me than paddling in the Everglades is. and a lot lonelier. It was wonderful to have Anne's companionship paddling in the Everglades. And times I've gone with my sister and brother-in-law or my son. Loneliness was a big thing for me on the trail, and much, much harder physically than
Oh,
canoeing. But
Wow.
both wonderful. I think the best part of both experiences for me was being outside for long stretches of time.
Well, remind me what the Appalachian Trail, I've been on bits of it, but where does it start? What's the farthest north? What's the farthest south? I don't recall.
Okay. The farthest north is Katahdin in Maine, and the
Wow.
farthest south is in Georgia.
Wow, I didn't
And
realize it went
Amicalola Falls. Yeah, it's a long,
Wow.
long trip.
Yeah, on foot.
Yeah.
Oh my,
Yes.
I can't imagine doing what Holly did. I cannot imagine
that's impressive.
walking for 5 months alone from Georgia to Maine. I just blows me away. But
Wow.
when I knew I wanted to go out there and paddle that 100-mile trail, and I thought, well, who will go with me? I knew instantly who would go with me because I knew what she had done. So
and
that worked out well.
and you said you get to sit down in this one.
Yes.
A little easier on the knees, right?
How did you know, Holly, that you would, I mean, what took you to the trail in the first place?
I don't know. It was something I always wanted to do. I had to wait until the kids got independent.
Yeah. Thank you.
There was probably something that happened at the beginning, maybe seeing a sign somewhere. We traveled a lot when I was young.
Very interesting.
It's fascinating. Thank
Well,
you so much.
Yes, I want to thank both of you. This has really been
you.
an interesting discussion. I loved your presentation. It will be a wonderful part of our video archives. So thank you so much for doing this today.
Thank you for giving us the opportunity, Georgia. It was
Yes,
lovely.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you
well,
so much. Yes.
thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.